Hello everyone and welcome to our feedback webinar series. I'm Chris and joining me today is Simon. As we expect people to start flowing into the webinar, numbers will build. I can see them going up and up and up and up. So just a few things just as we're getting started. Please feel free to ask questions as we go through the webinar. I've got my screen up and I'll keep an eye out for any questions, and we'll have a bit of a Q&A segment at the end. We do have a prize giveaway, as we do with all of our CK webinars. At the end of the session, we'll have a little bit of a giveaway for a £50 Amazon voucher, so please stick around for that. The aim of today's webinar is to show you some sort of really cool features and ideas that we've kind of come across in a recent engagement with a customer that we've had, which we think we want to share with you because it's some of the techniques that we've kind of implemented are very useful, especially for those of you who are still kind of leveraging SharePoint as a data source for your Power Platform creations. So I know that's quite common, and we'll talk today about why it is still so common that people are using SharePoint lists as a data source for Power Platform. But let's just quickly overview what we're covering. So the breakdown of the session today is we're going to sort of talk to you about how businesses are using Power Platform. We're going to understand what kind of technical challenges people are encountering now that it's more mainstream, that people are building not just citizen developer style apps and flows, but more enterprise level flows. So we've got to think about building sustainable life cycles by perhaps utilizing the solution feature within the Power Platform. Because we assist our customers with their endeavors in building Power Platform solutions as well as training them as well. If you are interested in consultancy support for building your Power Platform and other Microsoft 365 solutions in your tenant, we'll provide you with contact information if you want to have a chat with us about that. And as I mentioned, at the end of the session, we're going to give away that juicy Amazon voucher. Just a little bit about myself before we kick off. My name's Chris. I've been with Combined Knowledge for 10 years now. I'm in charge of the training team and our content that the company creates, manuals, videos, every kind of thing I check over to make sure is at the highest standard. I've worked alongside peers that have created the books for the Microsoft Step-by-Step book series, and I've also spoken on behalf of Microsoft at various events in the UK. So you might have seen me at a Microsoft event or some of the other community events around the UK. Joining me on the session today is Simon. Simon's going to jump in and just do a quick intro for himself.
Yes, so my name's Simon Gray. I've been with Combined Knowledge now about a couple of years now, isn't it, Chris?
That's right.
Actually, since joining Combined Knowledge, I've really gotten to grips with the Power Platform. I've taken it upon myself to do quite a number of the Microsoft certified qualifications for the App Maker, the Functional Consultant. My previous background was I was a web developer, so it kind of fell in quite nicely for me there, and I've been assisting Chris and the team with authoring some of the content, not as much as Chris, but also on the Training Plus system as well that we provide at Combined Knowledge. I've done a couple of these feedback webinars as well. Thoroughly enjoyed doing those, so look forward to going over something quite technical today that we were lucky enough to be involved with ever so recently. So I don't know if, Chris, you can click onto the next bit as well. I am actually trying to gain another one of those accolades today. After today's session, I'm going to have an attempt at the PL 400 course for the Developer Associate qualification. Just building on what Chris has said, we are also running courses for the App Maker PL 100, I believe it is. Is it the 100 or the 200? Yeah, the 100. So do check that out, and also the PL 900, which is the fundamentals for the Power Platform. So if you are interested in either of those qualifications, check out the website. As part of the training, which you'll go through with myself, we'll also be given a voucher for the actual exam itself. So do check that out if you are interested in gaining any of these shiny accolades that you can stick all over your room, as I have.
Yeah, if you can try and outperform Simon with the number of badges you can obtain, then that would be fantastic. Do let us know if you achieve that. Unfortunately, he's got a head start, and he's always getting more badges, so it's a challenge. Can you see that I've been left? If I go back, I've been left in the dirt, unfortunately. So he's got two.
You've got the data analyst one. That one's a very tricky one. So
yeah, that was good fun. You have to have a passion for data, but that was a really good one. So let's jump into why we're here today. So this is a case study. So typically, as case studies go, there is a partner that we've worked alongside to assist with their journey into Power Platform. Now, what's interesting about this particular customer, they are under an NDA, so we are going to be very vague, but they're very happy for us to talk about the appraisal system that we've been involved with. Now, to be truthful, they actually got a bit of a head start with this. They've already started to put in a probation system, which was live, and then they started building the appraisal system. And the customer came to us and asked, we've been on the training with Combined Knowledge a year ago. How have things changed? Are there things that we could be doing better? Are there things that you can see that might be an issue? So with that engagement, this particular customer has a role in the processes of national government, but it is not a government department, and it is not part of a government department. What it does is it orchestrates research councils, and it has approximately about 7,500 staff. Now, their appraisal system is actually a bit of a legacy tool for them. And tell me if this rings true to a few of you who are on the webinar today. This organization had been sort of using SharePoint as a bit of a backbone for their data. And because of that, to get the most out of SharePoint, you often lean on other tools. So you might, start off with a SharePoint list. You think, great, this has got a form and people can do data entry, but the form's not that great. Could we jazz it up? So, you get an info path form and drop that on top. Could the data talk to people? Could it move things along in its own way? Yeah, sure. You could get SharePoint Designer, start to do workflows in the back end, and that starts to knit together a fairly decent system. So when you jump on the train and get ushered to the cloud, the talk changes. You start to hear rumors that InfoPath, SharePoint Designer shouldn't really be using those. In fact, they're not really going to be supported past 2026. So that kind of raises the warning, and people are thinking, you really shouldn't be using those. And we've heard of the Power Platform, should we be using that? So under its own initiative, the appraisal system was set up by this organization. It wasn't live yet, but it had been designed to leverage SharePoint lists again, but also have maybe a Power App front end and maybe some Power Automate workflows that are managing things like the security and the communications around things. One of the most important things was it must be cloud-based. It has to be using future-proof services. So that's why InfoPath and SharePoint Designer weren't picked up for this particular appraisal tool. And also, we didn't want it to cost the world. In a few years' time, a proper appraisal tool was going to be purchased by HR. So imagine this being an interim solution. It's just meant to get us across that gap. That's what we were looking for. So this gave us an idea that this tool is a sort of short term. So we didn't want it to be at a large cost, but security is still at a primary. And we also wanted something like an application lifecycle management, something in place so that we can keep tweaking the app in the background whilst people were using it in production, and having an area for people to test the app. So those were the requirements that we had. And our first engagement with this customer was quite interesting. they were worried. They were saying, you know, we've used SharePoint because we have previous knowledge of it. The old appraisal system was in SharePoint. It was a SharePoint list. People are used to going into lists, going to the views. Our HR team are happy with that kind of interface. So, you know, my history is very much SharePoint orientated. I worked with Microsoft on the step-by-step book series for SharePoint. I love the tool. So, you know, I'm not here to say, you know, don't use SharePoint. And when we actually started talking to them, a lot had happened in that year. Since they went on the training, Dataverse for Teams became more of a feature. So rather than it being Project Oakdale as it was back in the day, it became a reality. So you could potentially have a database that is entrenched within a particular team in Microsoft Teams, and you could build apps and flows and bots that work off that database. The problem was, though, that although this provided a more secure database for the data to reside in, the problem was is that it could only be used within the context of Teams, and that actually was a limitation for this customer. They wanted to expose this app in different ways. Ideally, they actually wanted to create more of a kind of a website feel for this app, maybe embed it in SharePoint alongside a BI report and some other features and buttons that will help people use this particular tool set. So although it was an interesting concept, we didn't think that Dataverse for Teams would be perfect for this appraisal system. Secondly, Dataverse was just one step too far. It has a lot of features, but a lot of the features we weren't going to use, and there's the cost associated with Dataverse. So it's interesting. The app was, you know, half developed in SharePoint, and we all were thinking about it. We're saying, well, why don't we persevere with SharePoint? What are the technical ramifications of continuing to build this sort of interim solution in SharePoint? There were technical challenges, and quite a lot of these SharePoint specialists will probably already know about. So the current solution that was half built had a Power Apps front end sitting on multiple lists. So one SharePoint list sitting in SharePoint housed the actual appraisals. But every single appraisal that was created for a member of staff in the course of a month of April in one year to March the following year, that was the sort of year gap that we were covering, a person could create multiple objectives for themselves. So think of an appraisal. Think of you trying to kind of prove your worth, and you're thinking, this year I'm going to achieve X, Y, and Z. So you'd set yourself these objectives. So every appraisal that was created, multiple objectives were created. Let's say, you know, each appraisal would have 5 objectives. We're starting to think about the multiplication factor of, you know, let's say, you know, 7,500 staff all creating appraisals. And then on top of that, they're all creating objectives. So what are the limitations of SharePoint? I'm sure a lot of you know about the view limit. So you can't show over 5,000 items in a single view. Effectively, you'll get an error. Now, you can filter the view to reduce the amount of items, but effectively that filter has to be in place to kind of hide enough of the content for it to work. So one of the reasons why that's important is that the HR team was still using the actual list in the back end to look at certain information about the appraisals and get sort of statistics and summaries off the back of that. So we're aware that that view limit could potentially be an issue if we start to accumulate a lot of appraisals. And then the objectives, that was an issue as well, because each one of these appraisals and objectives need to be secure so that only the right people can access the information. So HR can see all of the objectives, all of the appraisals, but individuals can only see their own. And maybe their managers will be able to see their subordinates' objectives and appraisals as well. So I don't know if you know that you're not allowed more than 50,000 unique permissions in each SharePoint list. So that was a bit of a gotcha when we kind of considered that if we project maybe 3,000 appraisals a year, that may generate 48,000 objectives. So the reason that we'd have multiple objective lists by the end of the day is that we were trying to avoid that 48,000 figure. So every single year, perhaps, would need another objectives list and another objectives list to grow and grow and grow this solution until we get our end solution further down the line. So as you can see, these limitations of SharePoint don't make it a particularly ideal position to be in. And thinking about the app in another way, we had to keep the data secure. So that doesn't just happen on its own. We needed a workflow to identify the parties that should have access to the appraisal and lock down that security. So that workflow had to run each time the item was modified. So maybe you change your line manager, you've had a different change in management. So you'd have to be able to change your appraisal, your line manager, and that should be able to cascade down onto the item in SharePoint. And also a separate workflow was implemented to send communications about mid-year appraisals and end of year reviews. All of these kind of changes that are happening through the course of the appraisal need to send communications. So as you can see, the scope of this would require multiple lists and multiple workflows to keep the solution ticking over. And there's a bit of a worry that what happens if the communication workflow goes wrong? You could irritate a lot of people if the workflow accidentally pushed a load of communications out to lots of people in the business. So a lot of the design here kind of makes sense, but when you start to read between the lines, start to look at the limitations, there can be a few problems there. Simon, I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to quickly jump in with there, or should I jump on to the next segment?
No, I think you've got everything spot on there. Obviously, like you said, we'd come in and the tool had already evolved to a certain point, and the problems that they were coming across were, how do we link up our multiple objectives in this list with the items in our existing list? And again, initially we had recommended or looked towards the Dataverse scenario because of that relational design, which becomes part of Dataverse, but within SharePoint, that technology doesn't exist. So typically we have to set that up ourselves. And
the Dataverse having the entrenched security as well, much easier than SharePoint, which, as the name suggests, shares it.
Yeah, exactly. So one thing to kind of point out about the data here that we're working with is that it is what I would refer to as sensitive data. So although it's still secure, it's behind all of our Microsoft security, our credentials, etc. Like you said, when we share a SharePoint list, everyone we share it with typically has access to it. And so the row level of security was what the organization was utilizing. But it comes with, again, as you said, a couple of gotchas. One is the 50,000 row limit, in that once we go over that, even by one, everybody can see that record. And again, this is personal information. So no, I think you've covered every point there for where the system was. I mean, bear in mind, this is still where it was when we kind of landed into the project as well.
Yeah, sort of landed in the hot zone, so to speak.
So yeah.
So one of the things that we looked at when working on this particular project was where we could potentially push simplicity. So cutting a few workflows out would mean dividends in having a cleaner solution by the end of the day. But the biggest issue is the data source. So one of the things that I have a lot of experience with is building workflows and forms, and in some of the projects that I've worked with different customers locally and internationally is the tool is very important, but sometimes features in one tool can be transposed into another as long as you know what you're doing. For those of you who have worked with Nintex products, Nintex is a Microsoft partner that designed initially form and workflow solutions for SharePoint on-prem, which eventually became cloud, which eventually spawned a whole different arrangement of services from Nintex. One of my favorite features in Nintex Forms, which is a little bit like InfoPath or a lighter version of Power Apps, is a concept of repeating sections. Think about a form, and on that form, it asks for your phone number. And you have 3 phone numbers. You've got home, you've got mobile, you've got office. So you could design a form that assumes that, but you'll end up with blank fields. So you might say, I've only got a phone number, I don't have a home phone number, I don't have an office number, this is my number. So they fill out one of the 3 fields. So it would be a better form if we could say, what's your phone number? And they could click add, and then they could put their phone number in, then click a drop down and say, that's my personal number. And then they could optionally say, actually, I have another number. They click on add, and then they put in their next number and say that's my office number, and then they click add and they say this is my elephant's number. You know, the elephants have phones. So you can see that you could potentially have lots and lots and lots of expansion in a particular form. So using that terminology, I was like, well, sure, what if, you know, the appraisal didn't have to have separate objectives? What if we could use like a repeating section scenario where you go into a singular record and you create multiple objectives within the appraisal, and then when you submit it, it stores all of that data in a singular column in SharePoint. Is that possible? So we'll go into, is it possible and how is it implemented shortly. And I'm going to eventually hand over to Simon, who's going to kind of walk you through the concept of this kind of repeating section logic within a Power App. But to cut a sort of a long story short, we did implement it to quite a high level of success. We're actually quite proud of it, to the point where this particular design will be hopefully used in their probation app, which is currently live, but something that we're looking at sort of retrospectively improving. So we'll show you a little demo of that. That's my favorite demo of the day. Simon's going to be doing that one. The other thing that I wanted to talk about with pushing simplicity is actually looking at the solution they had, and maybe the thing that they were most worried about, if I go back for a second, this communications workflow that could potentially have the risk of upsetting and pushing notifications unnecessarily, maybe simplify it. So one of the ways that I simplify that, and I'll show you in my demonstration after Simon's, is utilizing connections inside Power Apps to do the job of a workflow. So rather than getting the workflow to send out the communications, you can connect to services like Office 365 Outlook, and with a very short formula, you could actually push an email to people referenced within your app incredibly easily. In fact, when this solution was shown to some of the testers, they loved it. They said they absolutely really enjoyed that feature. They thought it was really good. One thing that I will say, I'm going to hand across to Simon very shortly, but Simon will show you what the repeating sections look like in his app. And the funny thing is that people were more interested in the red, amber, green status color button than the whole concept of the repeating sections. So it just goes to show, if you have something colorful and pretty, the whole technology behind the scenes falls apart to something so simple.
Yeah, it was quite funny, wasn't it? Because we'd spent hours and hours trying to come up with a functional solution, and that was just something we put in at the end to kind of just make it easy to spot what was going on. And yet that was the first point that everyone commented on. So that's just a problem with building things as a rule, really.
I'm going to pop over and make you the presenter size. So when you're ready, just start sharing your screen and off you go. So lovely. I can see from your end. Yeah.
Fantastic. So just to kind of build on Chris's point there a little bit, I come from a more technical background in terms of creating websites and tools and services than Chris had. So I took the kind of forefront for this part of the project with the guys, and I was coming up with all these convoluted systems that would circumnavigate some of the requirements. So one of the big ones was the cost. Trying to keep that need for premium licenses down to a minimum. It was Chris that brought the idea of the repeating sections into the kind of the fold, and again, keeping in that whole mind of keeping things simple, made things much easier for us to work on in terms of helping the organization create this tool. But also, again, we've had so much success with that, we've been able to concentrate on other areas of the app that weren't quite so great. So sometimes just taking a step back and thinking, is there a better way of doing this, can really just help you out as a whole. So here we have a kind of basic version of the entire app. Obviously, we're here to look at the objectives section. So we've got a number of users on our first screen on the left-hand side. And you can see just below each one of them, there's a number of objectives already available for each person. Now, that's an important thing to note at this point, because although we've kind of sang about this little solution being fantastic up until this point. It does have its own drawbacks, which are key when understanding whether or not you should employ something like this in your system. So if I just click through onto Helen's appraisals system here, what we've got going on our screen, at the top we've got some information about the user, and then towards the bottom we've got the areas where we can actually create an appraisal or edit one, and then we've also got the actual objectives associated to that appraisal. So it's as simple as essentially saying I want to add in a new one. I click on add, and it's added in the record training plus videos for me down there at the bottom. I can click on the edit button, and it allows me to change the status, and this is the color coding that Chris was on about just a second ago there. If I press the save icon, it's now changed it to green. So we can interact with these objectives. They're all contained currently within my screen. And if you remember back to the first screen, it said I had 2 objectives. Now it says I have 3 at the top of the screen here. So I've got one that's completed, one that's in progress, and one that is not started. If I press save, it's then going to go back to the first screen, and it has saved my objectives.
It's worth noting. Yeah, it's worth noting as well that this was genuinely a proof of concept. This is the one that we actually sort of showed to the customer. So if it looks rough, it's because
we have enhanced it a few ways to make it a little bit better, but the colors were mainly to show you the different areas of the screen and what's going on. Now that all sounds great, sounds pretty straightforward, but where is that information stored? So that information is stored over in our SharePoint list. Now back to Chris's slides earlier on, we had the 2 list scenarios where we had the appraisal stored in one list, and traditionally in a relational database we would have a secondary list to store simply the objectives, and we'd link between them. Now this wasn't really a viable option for us within the remit of what we were trying to work within our requirements. So what we did with this repeating tables section from Nintex was we actually stuffed all of that information into a single column. So this column here, we've got a column called table. Basically, this contains all of the information from each individual objective. So if I just double click and open this one up and scroll down, all of that information, as you can see, has been stuffed into this singular column. So we've effectively created a virtual table within our column here. Now, this is where I want to kind of point out one of the restrictions. We can't really query this information very well. So if I wanted to count how many of my objectives were in total or not started, I couldn't really do that without some convoluted system. So this is where we had to physically save the different totals as we're going along. Now this is a piece of information that HR were going to be pretty interested in, and this is one thing that the proof of concept that we built actually highlighted to us. So we built the proof of concept, and HR said, well, we want to know how many objectives have not been completed. We need to know this information. So by just building the proof of concept, they liked the idea. Technically, it was available, but more importantly, we highlighted bits that were missing, and we could add them in then as part of our final deployment of this little solution. So let's have a quick look then at how that kind of all goes together. So I've quickly thrown together a little slide to kind of highlight what's going on. So here we've got our objective screen where we're going to be adding in the objectives to the bottom of our screen. So we've got on the screen load, so we are going to get technical now on Power Apps terms. So when the screen becomes visible, on the visible property, what we're actually doing is taking the information from that SharePoint list, and then we need to use a function called split to quite literally split up the information in that column. So the column will be made up of a couple of different delimiters. So if you've ever worked with CSV files or Excel and you've had to take information and use delimit functions in Power BI or Excel or other software, it's exactly that terminology we're using here. We're splitting information up, and then we're referencing that information into a collection. So a collection is a virtual table that we can't see or interact with at this point, but we can reference it, and that's exactly what we're doing at the bottom of our screen. Our gallery is simply referencing to that collection that we made, when the screen loaded up. So the screen loaded up, it grabbed the information from SharePoint, it split out the different areas into the different columns and created this virtual table for us. We can then use the form located just above our gallery to both edit, add, or even remove objectives from this collection. Now, all of this information is being stored within the Power App itself. So in order to get that information back over into SharePoint, obviously we need to save. Now, we can't just grab this information easily and quickly and put it back into SharePoint. We do have to do a little bit of work to it first. So on our save function, before we actually submit our form off to SharePoint, what we need to do is concatenate. So again, take another function within Power Apps, concatenate all of the information from our gallery, and then take that and put it into a variable. And this variable we've called return value. We've kept everything nice and simple for the proof of concept, just to kind of get through things nice and quickly. And then once we have information into our variable, we can then, we're cheating here a little bit. We've basically got a card within our form control and we've hidden it. So no one can see it, no one can interact with it, but we can as the app maker. And we've taken that value from our return value, which again is just a concatenation. So reversed what we did when the screen was created. And we've created one big long string that's going to be put into our SharePoint list when we press save. So kind of like a circle of life going on there. We take the information, we split it up, we display it so it's nice and easy for people to see and interact with, and then upon save, we reassemble it back into how it was delivered to us via SharePoint and save that back in. So a quick look at how that kind of works. Here I've kind of taken a snapshot of some of the information stored within SharePoint, and as you can see, although we can read the text, there's a lot going on in there. We've got some HTML elements, for example. This was one of the technical issues that we had with users wanting to use the rich text editor. So the rich text editor, essentially within Power Apps, is going to add in additional values. It's going to add in additional characters that we're not going to see unless we look at the raw data, which is essentially what we're doing here. So we had to come up with some characters that we knew weren't going to exist in the real world, or if they did, is very, very, very rare. And what we need to break up in this single table is two items. First, we need to separate the record. So each record represents each individual objective. And then within each record, we've then got our different columns. So we've got our status, we've got our title and description, etc., etc. So those are actually broken up by two different sets of characters. So records are separated by a hyphen, a double pipe, and then a hyphen. So it's easy for us to see if we just have a quick look on this example just here. We've got a hyphen, double pipe, and hyphen there. So this is showing us, just from reading that, there's two records in here. And then we separate the columns within those records by a hyphen, exclamation mark, semicolon, hyphen. Again, if we look through our record, we've got an item there, and then there's an item just down here. So every time we come across the initial hyphen, double pipe, hyphen, the Power App knows this is a new record. Then for each record, it then splits this out again and knows that each time it comes across the hyphen, exclamation mark, semicolon, hyphen, to break that information up into different columns. So quickly, as an overview, this is kind of a snapshot of what's going on the visible property for our app, and then that will build the collection, which is then viewed by our gallery. So just to kind of quickly whiz around that on the screen, if we go over to our app, which is what we're looking at here, close that down. If we go to screen number 2, which is our objective screen, on the visible property for our screen, we've got quite a number of lines of code going on here. So what we're actually doing first we're resetting our variables just to make sure everything is clear before we get started. Then we are grabbing our information from our SharePoint list. That is what we're going to be working on and splitting up. Then for each item, we've got our for all function, and we're then splitting that information based upon that hyphen, double pipe, hyphen. Then that is then subsequently splitting everything again based upon the hyphen, exclamation mark, semicolon, hyphen again. Now, to make things easier for us to kind of read and understand, we actually set these as variables at the beginning when the app initially loads. Therefore, if anything needs to change, if we need to change the delimiter for any reason, we only have to do that in a singular place. And essentially what's going on here is it's splitting up all of this information into our collection. So if we quickly go to our view section, go to collections, our information has been split up for us here. So we've got information about the status, the name, and then the identification number. And again, we have made improvements to this, so it's a little bit easier to follow in the final version. But essentially, that's all the code there that is breaking up and assembling our collection ready for use in our gallery at the bottom, just down here. So our gallery is referencing to our collection just here. We've then got a small form set up, which isn't actually a form control at all. It's just a group of controls that we've kind of assembled together. These are then going to allow us to add in new objectives. So using the collection functions, we can add in new objectives. We can also edit objectives, and then we can also remove objectives as well. Then from here, we press our save button. And on the save button, like I said on the slides, what we first need to do is concatenate all that information together. So we grab all of that information together, assemble it into one big string, and then on our form, if we just grab our form quickly to make it easier to find things, we have a data card. So just open that up, called table. This data card is currently invisible. We can't see it as a user. So if I open that up and zoom in ever so slightly, as you can see here, we've got the same information displayed in there again. And that information is then being saved back to SharePoint. So quite a technical feat, that one, in terms of first understanding how we needed to go about kind of storing the information. We needed to use a multiple lines of text column within SharePoint itself. And I can't remember off the top of my head, Chris, I'm not sure if you can remember this, exactly how many characters, but I think it was 6,000.
Yeah, it was a very good question that Ian asked, because he actually asked the question in the chat as well in regards to what the limit was. So oddly enough, this is, as a SharePoint specialist, is something that's very poorly documented. So yes. What I literally did was copied and pasted a paragraph until it got up to about 1,000 characters, and then copied and pasted that endlessly until I got up to, you know, tens of thousands of characters. And all I did was, like a sad person that I am, started to stuff that data until it got to the point of failure. And I had to, I think Simon sent me a website that did like a character count, because I think I had to kind of work out what it was. It was about 64,000 characters, because we literally got to 64,001, and it was like, no, we're not having this, we're not saving this data. And as I was saying to Ian in the chat, we did try and work out what the average, you know, what's the longest someone's going to put in their objective. We looked at the test data, and then we looked on average at how many objectives people would create. And we'd realize that they'd literally had, you know, if they used, like, you know, quite lengthy objectives, they weren't going to hit that limit. So we were quite confident that an appraisal for our year was going to be suitable in that case for that string.
Yeah, so I think that was actually per line as well, wasn't it? And the default for a multiple line of text is 6 lines, and you can extend that.
And you can go to 255, can't you? So
yeah,
it was almost monstrous.
Infinite amount of data that you could store in this. The only obvious drawback to this is that again, there's not much in terms of querying that we can do. We kind of fall into this the delegation issue that you get with Excel. It mainly acts like Excel at this point. Anything you want to do, you have to physically query yourself. And so by just adding in the metrics quite literally counting the information as we're adding it in and storing that information in an additional column. Our HR guys were happy that they could quickly and easily query the data source to find out how many people hadn't completed objectives or had completed. And again, that falls in line with your Power BI report that I assume that you built up on based on everything. So yeah. I'm just going to hand that back over to you then now. I should be able to at least.
Yep.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much. So
back on.
There we go. So another interesting aspect to the customer that we're working with is they're sort of operating across a multi-tenancy. So they're not just one tenant, they're actually using multiple tenants, and they're trying to sort of bring all of these different tenants together. But one of the things that the primary tenant that this solution was built in was doing is adding these guests in other tenants to this tenant as an actual guest. We were finding that no fault of Power Apps, it was more an issue with SharePoint, but these guests were not turning up in people picker fields. So some of you might have had experiences with people picker fields in SharePoint. So it's a type of column that allows you to reference people or groups of people. And it's been getting better and better in SharePoint Online. You can see a portrait photo of the individual, their name, and other information about that person, like their job role. But when these guests from different tenants were using the app, they couldn't find either themselves, or they couldn't reference a line manager. So we actually did a lot of experimenting with that, and one thing that we found was in the tenant a simple PowerShell script, which was set SPO tenant, and then the commandlet show people picker suggestions for guest users space $true, and that helped tremendously in populating the guests accounts into the people picker fields. And trust me, that was a huge head scratcher. I think we spent a lot of time trying to kind of work out what the issue was in that particular context.
Yeah, so just to kind of build on that slightly, remembering that Power Apps is not going to give you or a user any additional tools that you can't already do. It's basically, I like to think of it as a tool of convenience. It's a highway between 2 points. If I was going to travel from where I live to the city and there was no motorway, I'd have to go through the A roads and the B roads, and I can get there. But Power Apps is this direct route from point A to point B. And when looking into this issue, obviously from the organization's point of view, they saw this as a case of actually Power Apps isn't doing this, so it must be a Power Apps problem. But Power Apps can only work with the data source and the data that it's got coming in. So this is where myself and Chris were like, no, this is definitely a SharePoint issue and not a Power Apps issue. And the ultimate reason why this came about was because, again, of our probation app that the organization was working on. Everything worked fine there, but not here, and they couldn't understand why. And there's actually 2 levels in which you can activate this setting on it. There's the tenant level, and then there's also per site level. They actually jumped in a bit both feet at one point, activated it at tenant level, and have since come back to us and said, actually, this has fixed a few problems across a few sites for us, because we were having this issue in a few different locations. And again, it was because of their setup with having multiple tenants and guest accounts as a result of that multiple tenancy. Yeah, we did spend quite a bit of time on this one, didn't we, Chris, trying to resolve what was causing the problem. I think you were even investigating the different field types themselves, weren't you, and things like that. We even thought about building our own people picker at one point to get around the issue.
Julie has asked quite an interesting question about scaling the height of the description of the objective, whether that's going to hit a specific height or whether it could potentially kind of be unlocked and allowed to scale a bit larger. Just as a brief response, Si, is that something that they could kind of potentially do with containers, the scaling height containers, or do you think that's something that you could just do in the control properties to kind of make the height of it scale better?
So we're using a gallery to display the objectives. Obviously, there are a number of different layouts for galleries as well. Some of them have the fixed height, some of them have more of a fluid height. But I believe most of them, if not all of them, have the property called template size. And dependent upon your layout choice, if you've gone horizontal, if you've gone vertical, that template size will determine the height or width of each individual item. And it's a formula. So any dynamic formula that you can come up with would in fact make that dynamic. Now, the problem we have with the objectives is obviously, I'm not sure off the top of my head if there's any way of counting the amount of text that is visible. Now, you could come up with something a little bit more responsive, should we say, so everything is collapsed down, and on click action, you could make that one grow potentially. But yes, the template size, dependent on which layout you've got, will affect the height or width of that one.
One thing just to add to that is the previous webinar that we ran, Simon did on responsive design Power Apps.
Yes.
So Julie, if you jump on YouTube and search for the Combined Knowledge channel, it's the last webinar that we ran. There's some really good tips on kind of automating the height of components within an app to make it more responsive for the size of the screen.
So yeah, a lot of referencing of either parent, so parent dot height, parent dot width, if it exists within another component, or obviously referencing directly the control itself. Within galleries, we have the template area.
It's a good question though, because we will touch upon this later, Julie, but there's definitely an element of nice to haves when it comes to these solutions. Like we always build something and said, oh, that would be great, that would be great. So definitely, yeah, we're always very happy to kind of facilitate these wants and desires from an app. But quite often we have to look at the deadline and say, oh, maybe we'll come back to that one. But yeah, and having that end user eye for your app is very important to understand like what you think will be an improvement. One of the other improvements that I wanted to mention just before we kind of summarize the session is a really quick win that I wanted to kind of promote to you guys, which was we had the guys in charge of the appraisal app had a whole workflow for sending communications out, and they were worried about that sort of bombarding people with notifications. So effectively, one of the things that I kind of wanted to create a quick proof of concept about is a really cool little connector that is basically the Microsoft Office 365 Outlook connector. So when you're building your apps and you're looking at adding sort of data sources, you've got your connectors, and you can sort of search for different data sources. There's the Office 365 Outlook connector. So in their app, they had reference to line managers and their email addresses. So all of this information was documented. What they wanted to do was effectively take that information and push out an email and just take maybe some comments about how you're progressing your appraisal. So again, this is proof of concept. It's very boiled down, very simple, but I'm halfway through my mid-year review. I've got some comments to say I'm struggling to achieve my objectives. I don't have enough time, or there's reasons that I'm not getting through my objectives. So one of the things that we looked at is perhaps if I hit play here, just showing you that we have just a simple button, like an icon that we've added with an on select that toggles on and off a little it's basically just a rectangle with some buttons on it and some text. It's nothing special, but these little pop-ups are so easy to make. You just have a variable that you toggle the visibility of this group on and off with. But if I click confirm, I can actually send an email out, and it's that confirm button. If I actually just hit that again and come out. So that is literally just setting a variable of the visibility of this group called confirmation to true or false. And inside this group, we have our button. And if you have a look at the button itself, it's got Office 365 Outlook, send email v2. So that's a function of that connection that allows us to specify who the email is going to. So this is basically the line manager that we have on the previous form. So that's line manager A. So that's the email address here. And if we go back over and just look at that again, expand that out. In here, we've got the subject. I was being very lazy here. I just called it appraisal comments, but you could pull in properties from other controls in your app. And then the comments are coming from text input 1. Lazy me. I haven't even changed the name of my controls, but text input 1, guys, is just this. This is text input 1. So it's just going to basically send an email with those comments. So yes, that could be jazzed up a lot more. But what's interesting about that is that I did say it was a quick win. They managed to scrap a whole complicated workflow that was causing them a bit of anxiety for a very simple and actually a feature that people actually commented quite highly of. They say, oh, I really like the fact you get a pop-up in the app the way you can just say, I want to send these comments across to this user. So it's very simple, but just a simple connector like that really simplified a double workflow scenario. Right, I thought I'd throw that in there as a little bit of a tidbit of information. I think the last thing that we want to just clarify in this webinar is an effective application lifecycle management. And that is actually part of the Power Platform. If you haven't heard of it, it's basically a feature called Solutions within the Power Platform. And I'm going to kind of run you through the gist of how we kind of turn this into a solution. One of the things just to be aware of is in Power Apps, we have a lot of what we call citizen developers. A citizen developer is basically someone who uses the default environment within Power Apps or within Power Automate to build flows and apps. The default environment is a very special environment. Everyone can create an app within it. And you know, within that environment, there are probably like less constraints. But if you wanted to create a more formal development, test, and production system, you'd have a development, test, and production environment, and you can control who can create apps in there, and you could control who can utilize the apps in there. So what we did within this tenant is we had a development environment that was set up, which exclusive teams could use. We then had a test environment which slightly more testers had access to, so not the whole business, just people who are responsible for testing apps. They had the ability to work with apps and test apps within that particular environment. And then we had a production environment, which of course the app will end up in, and people across the business will start consuming the app. Now, what's interesting a thing is it's like shifting a sandcastle. You can shove a spade under it, but if you're quite rough with it, it will crumble before you move it to its next location. And think about it, we are really moving stuff because in fact, we had a test SharePoint list and a test SharePoint site, and then that was separate from the production site. So there's a production SharePoint site with the production data. So all the real data's there, all the test data's here. So what we did is we built the app and built the workflow and created an environmental variable that referenced the list. And that environmental variable was part of the solution. And when we got the app and the workflow ready for testing, we simply moved the solution to the test environment, where the audiences were accessing the app and putting data into the test system. They give us feedback, we take that on board, perhaps we'll go back to development, do some updates, push it through to test. When it comes to getting to production, what we do is when we push the app as a solution into another environment, we can change the environmental variable to look at the new SharePoint list with the live data. So we just watch that, that turns green. So we're asked, you know, your app and your workflows are linking to a SharePoint site and a list. Do you want to change that? Yes, we do. We don't want it to be the test one, we want it to be live one. So this solution now is looking at the live data. It's very elegant. Simon will probably have some additional insights just to provide on top of that.
Yes, so the application lifecycle management, or ALM, is still relatively new in the Power Platform. It is still having lots of changes. It's getting a lot of attention at the moment. We did actually struggle initially with the use of the environmental variables because for some there's a few bugs still within the system. They are still ironing things out. SharePoint is currently the only data source that is supported by environmental variables. And so if you think, oh, great, I could use my development SQL server, and then I can switch it over to my prod one. At the minute, only the SharePoint data connection supports the environmental variables. It is a bit tricky to use. A lot of people are still struggling with actually implementing it. They are working on it as we speak. They are improving it all the time. I fully expect it to be up and running within the next 12 months or so as a reliable tool to use. One thing to note with the whole solution item is that a solution basically can encompass anything within the Power Platform. Typically, they are used for packaging up solutions. So apps that have cloud flows or multiple different components within an app can all be bundled into one solution, which can then be kind of bundled up and a nice tidy bow tied into it, and that can then be deployed into a customer's environment. So third-party organizations now are able to build tools in their own environments and then deploy them across into an entirely different tenant. Now, again, they are still in their early stages, so there are still teething troubles when utilizing the environment variables. One thing to note is that with the environments within the Microsoft 365, obviously they separate security, they separate who can create what, who can not create, who can access what in what way, but SharePoint isn't part of that instance-based access, and so it operates separately. And so when we're in our development or test system, just like Chris has highlighted here, we're still pointing at exactly the same list. It doesn't matter where the app is, it's based upon that user's access within that environment. And that's one of the questions we get a lot. How do I switch over to our production list easily? It's doable within a Power App, but it's very manual, and you can inadvertently break things as well. But one thing to note is that if you make any changes to the functionality or the core of your list in either the production or the dev or the test, those changes will also need to be made at the same time that the solution is also deployed. So if you make a change to a column and you need to now deploy your solution live, you will need to take that existing solution down temporarily while you make those changes. Yeah. So do bear that in mind as well. That was one thing that caught us out.
So I guess lessons learned from this engagement is proof of concept. So quite often the discussion happened around how are we going to do this, how are we going to do that. It's very easy to go into your own tenant and start building and playing and creating something that you can sort of show to a customer. One thing Simon's quite keen on is the fact that you can actually get a free developer environment that has access to all the premium features without the need for any licensing. So it's a great little play area for someone who's trying to build a proof of concept like we've been discussing. We're quite clear, simplify where possible. So a lot of the techniques that we discussed today were to simplify a rather more complex solution and think across your tools. One of the limitations we talked about earlier was the 5,000 row limit for 5,000 items for SharePoint views. We can do a much better job with Power BI to replace views and get something a little bit more bespoke in front of the customer. The other thing that we had the benefit of is that all of the techniques that we kind of discussed in building the appraisal app could potentially be leveraged in the upcoming probation improvement. So the probation app in this organization is live, but the same improvements that we've made on the appraisal app can be transferred. And very important, thoroughly test with your peers, test the whole app, test it from start to finish. And you'll be surprised by the range of feedback that you get. And remember that if you get a lot of feedback, similar to the request Julie had about the auto height on text fields, if you start getting a lot of requirements building on top of what you're actually meant to deliver, have a wish list, put things to the side and say, yep, we'll do that in V2, but we need to get V1 across the line. So just to finish up with, because we're nearly out of time on our webinar, if you want to contact Combined Knowledge about any consultancy needs for Microsoft 365 around anything up to the Power Platform, do contact us at sales@combined-knowledge.com. If you like what you've been hearing and think that we can help you, do get in touch with us. If you are still around, and 25 people are, which is great, we are also going to basically have a bit of a go at question and answers very shortly. So if you do have any questions outstanding, we can have a chat with you at the end of the webinar. But before we do that, our contact information is up on the slide. And if you could put a hashtag consultancy in the chat, we're going to find out who you guys are and randomly pick anyone who's done hashtag consultancy in the questions panel. So go over to questions. Some of you have used the questions so far. Tiffany's just put a lovely thank you into the questions area. So just go over to questions. You don't have to oversell yourself. Just do a hashtag consultancy. Because you signed up to the webinar, we'll know what your contact email address is. So after the session today, I'm going to get in contact with my colleague Aaron, and we're going to randomly select someone for a £50 Amazon voucher, which we'll email to you after the session is over. That'll either happen this afternoon, because I think Aaron is still around, or it will happen tomorrow morning at the latest. But if you do get an email from us in your mailbox from Aaron saying congratulations, you've won a £50 voucher, congratulations, and hopefully you'll put it to some good use. So thank you very much, guys. I really appreciate you sticking around for the webinar. I'll leave this information up on the screen because I know that a few of you may take a few more moments to do so. And very shortly, if you are a fan of our webinars and you do come back for the feedback webinars, Simon and I are building a Power App that actually is a roulette wheel for selecting the winner of the competitions at the end of each of our sessions. So that will happen shortly. So if you stick around and jump onto our sessions in the future, we'll use an app, because there should be an app. I think we got. Yeah. We got so far with the concepts, but we'll get there in the end, and we'll have a bit of a laugh. Or we can show you the bare bones as it stands for now, and then you can.
I have put into the chat as well. Hopefully everyone can see it. The link to the developer plan, which you mentioned, which is free. So yeah, definitely get your dev teams looking at that. It just means they've got a place to play that's safe. But also they've enhanced what it can do now. You can share the apps and stuff from there as well, which is useful. So you can kind of start sharing it with your peers, and they can see what's going on and things like that. So yes.
Perfect, thanks, Si. So it is 4 o'clock, so we'll finish up there. If you do have any questions, do pop them into the chat. We'll review the chat over the next couple of minutes. If there aren't any further questions, we'll close the session off. So thank you very much for everyone who entered into our competition. There's still an opportunity for those of you who haven't put hashtag consultancy into the chat to do so now. And we'll keep an eye out, and we'll do our prize draw once the session is over. So thank you very much, everyone. Still having a look through for any questions. So let me just have a quick read of what we've got so far. Yeah. So James just mentioning about the ALM features. Lovely. Okay, you can't see any further questions. I will just leave the session open for another minute, just in case anyone is halfway through writing a question. We don't get the little bubbles to say that people are half writing a question. That kind of features are left to Microsoft Teams and other chat devices. But GoToWebinar feels a bit dated when you start to use all of these new tools. Hopefully next time we run a webinar as well, Simon will get his OBS working. He can basically put his face anywhere on the slide deck now, which is quite exciting. So that'll be interesting.
So Daniel's asked, did you find it okay to include repeating tables in your app? Yeah, it went really well. In fact, of all the things that we've put in, that's been the least touched.
Did they say that no news is good news? I think, if you see something.
We did do a lot of tweaks. It is a much different version to what we've got now. We had to put in a better ID system, which is basically a random number gets generated. The ordering was a bit tricky sometimes to deal with. and we ran into a bug, didn't we, where we could actually end up with duplicates, even though in the original there wasn't any duplicates. But yeah, that was the ID solution to that.
Yeah, it was just an additional element that was it just hidden in the background, but it was used
It
to
helped
sort of
that everybody was testing that though, didn't it? So you were testing it, the other guys were testing it as well, and we had about 4 or 5 people attacking it from all angles, and that helped get it through the gate much quicker than some of the other tools where we've just been working on, myself and one of the other guys, and definitely, like you said, getting people to test it from all angles, all levels of account, as well. You can't just assume that something is going to work and then I've done it here, it works for me. That caught us out on a couple of issues. But yeah, getting people to test is really useful.
Yeah. I think
Yeah.
that sort of carries us through to the finish line. I think there's no further questions. So this content will go up on YouTube, hopefully this afternoon at the latest tomorrow. So if you want to share the link to your colleagues, if you think they'll find it useful, just check out the Combined Knowledge YouTube channel, and the content will be up there shortly. So from myself and Simon, thank you very much for joining us today. We'll leave you to your afternoons, and we'll be in touch with you if you've won our prize.
Speak to you soon, Chris.
Take care, everyone. Have a fantastic afternoon.